Morning light spilled across the polished floors of the design wing at Forrester Creations, illuminating a building that had long stood as a symbol of legacy, artistry, and family power. The halls were unusually quiet that day. Most of the senior designers had not yet arrived, and the silence allowed the soft hum of fluorescent lights and distant elevator chimes to echo faintly through the space. For decades, the company had carried the weight of its own mythology. It was not simply a fashion house but the physical embodiment of the Forrester dynasty. A place where ambition, creativity, and family loyalty had always been intertwined in complicated ways. Yet beneath the elegance of the building's glass walls and sleek furniture, tension had been building quietly for months. Rivalries between generations had begun to erode the fragile unity that once defined the company. That morning, however, the unfolding drama began with something almost mundane. A newly hired cleaning assistant named Elena moved through the executive offices with quiet determination. She had only started working for the company a week earlier and still carried the cautious awareness of someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. Elena knew the names that filled the building's history: Eric, Ridge, Steffy, Brooke. To her they were distant figures of influence, people whose reputations filled magazines and television interviews. She had never imagined she would be walking through the private spaces where those powerful figures worked. Eric's office was the final room on her cleaning schedule. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open. The office itself felt almost sacred, filled with decades of memories and achievements. Sketches from past collections hung framed along the walls. Awards sat carefully arranged across polished shelves. At the center of the room stood Eric's massive wooden desk, its surface spotless but carrying the faint signs of a life spent in creative work. Elena began her routine tasks: dusting shelves, wiping the glass surfaces, organizing scattered papers left from the previous evening. She moved carefully, aware that this was not just another office but the workspace of the man who had built the entire empire around her. When she opened the desk drawer to clean inside, her hand brushed against something unexpected. It was an old tape recorder. The device looked strangely out of place among the modern electronics scattered around the office. Its metal casing was scratched and worn, suggesting it had been sitting there for years. At first Elena assumed it had been forgotten, perhaps an artifact from an earlier time in the company's history. Curiosity, however, has a way of turning ordinary moments into dangerous discoveries. She pressed the small play button. The recorder clicked softly. For several seconds there was nothing but faint static. Then voices emerged. The first voice was unmistakable. Anyone who had spent even a few days around the building could recognize it. Steffy. Her tone was calm but cold, the kind of measured voice that suggested she believed every word she was saying was both necessary and justified. Another voice followed. Ridge. Elena froze as the conversation unfolded through the small speaker. The words that filled the quiet office were not casual remarks or harmless business discussions. They were strategic, deliberate, and disturbingly ruthless. Steffy and Ridge were discussing Eric. Not with affection, not with concern, with calculation. The recording captured them outlining a plan to push Eric out of the company he had spent his entire life building. They spoke about his influence weakening the company's future direction, about how the board needed younger leadership, about how Eric's emotional attachment to tradition was preventing Forrester Creations from evolving. But what truly shocked Elena was the detail. Steffi described a strategy designed to gradually isolate Eric's authority within the company. They planned to shift creative control away from him, presenting the move as a necessary business decision rather than a personal betrayal. One part of the plan involved transferring major design responsibilities to Katie, a move that would appear generous on the surface but would actually weaken Eric's central role in the company. Ridge agreed. Their voices carried no hesitation. They were not discussing a possibility. They were describing a strategy already in motion. Elena stopped the recording, her heart racing. She knew immediately that she had stumbled upon something dangerous. The conversation she had just heard was not meant for public ears. It was a private conspiracy between two of the most powerful figures in the company. For a long moment she stood in the quiet office trying to decide what to do. Finally, she picked up the recorder and left the room. RJ had always maintained a close relationship with Eric. Unlike many of the other family members, he admired his grandfather's vision and respected the legacy Eric had built from nothing. If anyone deserved to hear the truth hidden in that recording, it was him. Elena found RJ in one of the design studios later that afternoon. He was leaning over a drafting table, studying a series of sketches for an upcoming collection. The intensity of his focus reflected the quiet pressure he felt as the newest creative member of the Forrester family. RJ carried the weight of expectation from every direction. his father Ridge, his grandfather Eric, and the entire legacy of the company itself. When Elena approached and handed him the recorder, he looked puzzled. She explained where she had found it and what she had heard. RJ pressed play. The moment the voices began speaking, the color drained from his face. The room seemed to shrink around him as the conversation unfolded. Every word spoken by Steffy and Ridge struck him like a blow. These were not distant corporate figures discussing strategy. These were his sister and his father. And they were planning to remove Eric from the company he had created. By the time the recording ended, RJ's hands were shaking. Shock quickly transformed into anger. RJ had grown up believing that despite the constant drama surrounding the Forrester family, there was one unbreakable truth. Eric represented the heart of the company. He was not simply a founder or a chairman. He was the living symbol of everything Forrester Creations stood for. To hear his own family plotting to erase that legacy felt like witnessing a betrayal too large to ignore. RJ made a decision in that moment. The truth would not remain hidden. That evening, the entire Forrester and Logan family gathered in the large living room of the estate. What began as a tense but ordinary meeting quickly transformed into something far more explosive. RJ stood in the center of the room holding the recorder. His expression was darker than anyone had ever seen. He explained briefly how the recording had been discovered. The room fell silent as he pressed the play button. The voices of Steffy and Ridge filled the room. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Eric's face went pale as the conversation unfolded. Every word spoken by his daughter and son carried the unmistakable tone of calculated betrayal. The man who had dedicated his entire life to building the company listened as his own family discussed pushing him aside like an obstacle. By the time the recording ended, the silence in the room felt suffocating. Eric's body trembled. For a moment he seemed unable to breathe. Then the realization struck him fully. His own children had planned to remove him from the empire he had spent decades creating. The emotional weight of that truth was too much. Eric collapsed. Panic erupted instantly as family members rushed toward him. Hope and Finn knelt beside him while Brooke and Donna cried out in shock. Liam stood frozen near the doorway, unable to process the chaos unfolding before him. Across the room, Steffy and Ridge struggled to respond. They attempted explanations, arguing that the conversation had been taken out of context, insisting that their intentions had been misunderstood. But the recording had been too clear. The words were unmistakable. For the first time in years, the authority that Steffy and Ridge carried within the family began to crumble. Brooke's voice shook with disbelief as she confronted Ridge. Donna wept openly beside Eric's motionless form. The room filled with accusations, heartbreak, and outrage. Generations of trust collapsed in minutes. What had once been a powerful family bound together by shared legacy now stood divided by greed, ambition, and betrayal. Outside, ambulance sirens echoed through the night as paramedics rushed Eric toward the hospital. Inside the estate, the Forrester family remained frozen in the aftermath of a revelation that had shattered everything they believed about each other. And as Eric was carried away fighting for his life, one terrible question lingered in the silence left behind. If the man who built the Forrester empire could be betrayed by his own blood, what hope remained for the family that carried his name? The ambulance doors slammed shut with a hollow metallic echo that seemed to reverberate through every member of the Forrester family standing frozen in the driveway. Red emergency lights painted the mansion's white stone walls in flashes of crimson, turning the familiar estate into something that felt strangely foreign and cold. As the vehicle sped away carrying Eric toward the hospital, the family members left behind remained rooted to the ground, as though the gravity of what had just happened had pinned them in place. No one spoke at first. The silence felt suffocating. Inside the living room, the echo of the recording still lingered in everyone's minds like a ghost that refused to disappear. The words spoken by Ridge and Steffy had not merely revealed a business disagreement. They had exposed a calculated betrayal, one that struck directly at the heart of the man who had created the entire Forrester empire. RJ stood near the center of the room, still gripping the small recorder in his hand. His knuckles had turned pale from the pressure of holding it. In that moment he felt less like a designer and more like a witness to a crime that had shattered the foundation of his own family. Across from him, Ridge remained motionless. The confident authority that usually defined him had vanished, replaced by a rare uncertainty that he struggled to hide. His eyes drifted toward the door where Eric had been carried out only minutes earlier. The sight of his father collapsing had shaken him in ways he had not anticipated. Steffy stood beside him, her expression hardened into a defensive calm. But inside, her thoughts raced wildly. She had always believed she was protecting the future of the company. In her mind, pushing Eric to step aside had been a necessary step for the survival of Forrester Creations in a rapidly changing industry. Yet hearing the plan played back aloud, hearing it through the ears of the rest of the family, had transformed that strategy into something far uglier. Now it sounded like betrayal. Brooke was the first to break the silence. Her voice trembled with anger and disbelief as she turned toward Ridge. She demanded to know how he could have participated in something so cruel against the man who had trusted him more than anyone else in the company. Brooke had spent years defending Ridge's decisions to the rest of the family, insisting that beneath his ambition he still respected Eric's legacy. Tonight that belief felt shattered. Donna stood nearby with tears streaming down her face. Eric had always been the center of her emotional world. Seeing him collapse under the weight of betrayal had felt like watching a lifetime of love crumble. In seconds, she could barely look at Ridge or Steffy without feeling a surge of fury. Liam remained near the doorway, his expression filled with quiet shock. Only hours earlier he had been consumed by the fallout of his own scandal. But now the entire crisis felt insignificant compared to what had just unfolded inside the Forrester family. Hope moved slowly toward RJ, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. She understood the burden he was carrying in that moment. Exposing the recording had been the right decision, but it had also forced him to become the person who shattered the fragile illusion of unity within the family. Finn, standing near Steffy, looked deeply troubled. As both a doctor and a husband, he felt torn between two responsibilities. Part of him wanted to defend Steffy, to stand beside her no matter what. But another part of him could not ignore the pain he had just witnessed in Eric's eyes before the man collapsed. The room erupted into arguments soon after. Voices rose in waves of accusation and defense as decades of unresolved tension suddenly exploded. To the surface, Brooke demanded accountability. Donna accused Ridge of greed. RJ's anger grew sharper as he replayed the recording again in his mind. Ridge tried to explain. He insisted the conversation had been taken out of context. He argued that his intention had never been to destroy Eric but to protect the company from stagnation. In his mind, Eric had simply refused to accept that the industry had changed and that new leadership was necessary. Steffi echoed that argument. She insisted that she loved her grandfather deeply and would never intentionally harm him. The plan had been about protecting Forrester Creations, not destroying Eric's legacy. But the explanation sounded hollow. The recording had captured something undeniable: calculation, secrecy, and ambition that prioritized control over loyalty. For the first time in many years, Ridge and Steffi found themselves completely isolated within the room. The trust that once protected them had evaporated. Meanwhile, the ambulance carrying Eric raced through the dark streets of Los Angeles. Inside, paramedics worked urgently to stabilize him. His breathing had become dangerously shallow, and his pulse fluctuated erratically as the emotional trauma pushed his weakened body toward collapse. At the hospital, doctors rushed him into the emergency ward. News of Eric's condition spread quickly through the medical staff, many of whom knew exactly who he was. The founder of one of the most powerful fashion houses in the world now lay unconscious on a hospital bed, his life hanging precariously in the balance. Back at the estate, the arguments had begun to fade into exhausted silence. The family members stood scattered throughout the living room, each person lost in their own storm of thoughts. The once powerful image of the Forrester family, united by creativity, legacy, and loyalty, had been shattered in a single evening. RJ finally set the recorder down on the table. His anger had not faded, but it had transformed into something deeper and more painful. The truth he had exposed had come at a devastating cost. Steffi stared at the floor, her mind replaying the moment Eric collapsed. For the first time, the possibility that her actions had truly hurt him began to sink in. She had always believed Eric would eventually understand her intentions. Now she was not so sure. Ridge moved toward the window, staring out at the dark horizon beyond the estate grounds. The flashing ambulance lights had long since disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt almost unbearable. For decades he had fought to prove himself worthy of the Forrester name. Tonight he realized that ambition had pushed him to a line he might never be able to cross back from. And far away at the hospital, as doctors fought to stabilize Eric's failing body, a quiet truth settled over the entire Forrester family. The empire Eric built was no longer their greatest challenge. The real question was whether the family that carried his name could survive the betrayal that had just